For example, if the blooming of flowers occurs earlier than the arrival of pollinators, then the pollinators may not have access to the resources they need to survive and reproduce. It's also important to consider the impact of climate change on species that are already at risk of extinction due to other factors, such as habitat loss or overhunting. Climate change can exacerbate these threats and further increase the risk of extinction for these species. For example, the orangutan, which is already threatened by habitat loss due to deforestation for palm oil plantations, is now facing additional threats from climate change. Rising temperatures and altered rainfall patterns can lead to declines in the availability of food and water, which can further stress the population and increase the risk of extinction. Similarly, many species of marine animals, such as sea turtles and sea birds, are threatened by climate change-induced changes in ocean temperature and acidity. This can lead to declines in food availability and habitat quality, which can further stress populations that are already at risk. Finally, it's important to consider the role of conservation efforts in mitigating the impacts of climate change on species. Conservation efforts such as habitat restoration, captive breeding programs, and protected areas can help to preserve the biodiversity of our planet and provide a buffer against the impacts of climate change. For example, protected areas such as national parks and wildlife reserves can provide habitat for species to adapt to changing environmental conditions. Similarly, captive breeding programs can help to preserve genetic diversity and provide a source of individuals for reintroduction into the wild. One important aspect of the correlation between climate change and species development and extinction is the concept of adaptive evolution. Adaptive evolution occurs when populations of species adapt to changing environmental conditions through genetic changes that enable them to survive and thrive. For example, some species of birds are adapting to changes in temperature by laying their eggs earlier in the year, which allows their offspring to take advantage of the peak availability of food. Sources. Similarly, some species of fish are adapting to warmer waters by migrating to deeper, cooler waters where they can survive. Adaptive evolution can help species to cope with the impacts of climate change, but it is important to note that this process can take time and may not be sufficient to prevent declines in populations or extinction in some cases. Another important concept related to climate change and species is the idea of ecosystem services. Ecosystem services are the benefits that humans derive from ecosystems, such as clean air and water, pollination of crops, and regulation of climate. Climate change can have significant impacts on ecosystem services, as changes in the environment can disrupt the functioning of ecosystems and lead to declines in the services they provide. For example, changes in rainfall patterns can lead to declines in water quality, which can impact human health and the health of ecosystems. It's also important to consider the impact of climate change on the relationships between species. For example, some species have evolved to rely on each other for food or pollination, and changes in the timing of seasonal events can disrupt these relationships. One example of this is the relationship between the yucca plant and the yucca moth. The yucca moth is the only pollinator of the yucca plant, and the plant relies on the moth to pollinate its flowers and produce seeds. However, changes in the timing of the blooming of the yucca plant and the emergence of the yucca moth due to climate change can lead to a mismatch in their relationship, which can have negative impacts on both species. Additionally, climate change can also lead to the emergence of new diseases and the spread of existing ones, which can have significant impacts on ecosystems and species. For example, the spread of white nose syndrome, a disease that affects bats, has been linked to changes in temperature and rainfall patterns that favor the growth of the fungus that causes the